Okay. All right, and with that, I'm now going to introduce our speaker, Rebecca Ralph. Rebecca Ralph is a historian of Newfoundland and Labrador whose work has focused on studying church and education history. She completed her BA and MA at Memorial and received her PhD from the Department of History at the University of Calgary. Recently, she was the Institute for Social and Economic Research postdoctoral fellow at Memorial, where she carried out an oral history and archival research project on the abolishment of the province's denominational education system. Her work has been published in the journals of Newfoundland and Labrador Studies, Acadiensis, NQ, Newfoundland Quarterly Magazine, and Historical Studies in Education. Her talk tonight is part of a larger book project which will examine the history of denominational education from 1836 to 1997. I now pass the evening over to Rebecca Ralph, who will speak about her work under the title, From Collective Begging to Collective Bargaining, the Professionalization of Teachers and Their Influence on Reforming Newfoundland and Labrador's Denominational Education System. So Rebecca, please proceed.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here to join us tonight for my lecture. I'm very grateful to you all for attending. And also, of course, at this beginning here, I'd like to extend a warm thanks to the Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society for asking me to speak, and of course to our president, John Joy, the kind introduction. My talk tonight, as is mentioned, is part of a larger historical research project that is focused on understanding the development, evolution, reform, and ultimately the abolishment of denominational education in Newfoundland and Labrador. Throughout my research career, spanning from my master's degree at Memorial, where I studied under Hans Rollman, through to my doctoral and postdoctoral work, which was mentored by figures like David Marshall at the University of Calgary and also Jeff Webb at Memorial. My work has sought to understand the ways in which societies have chosen to build education systems, and particularly in the case of Newfoundland and Labrador, the way in which a church-state relationship shaped its education system in profound and significant ways. This work has been possible largely in part because of the accessibility and incredible support that I received for this research, both from local institutes such as the Institute for Social and Economic Research, an incredible body at MUN supporting researchers for decades, and also, of course, of the local historical community. The work that I've been able to do is possible because of the support of both public and private archives. One of the things I always like to highlight at the beginning of any talk or presentation of this nature is that there is an incredible abundance of resources for those who may be interested in Newfoundland and Labrador history, and especially if they might be interested in doing their own research and writing projects. Church archives are in the province are rich and quite open. For example, much of the research done that informs my work has been done at the Anglican Church's archive here in St. John's, as well as that of the Archdiocese, the United Church, and also, of course, rich research holdings that exist at Memorial University and its many archives and the rooms. And crucially as well for this talk, there are two other additional resources that I'll be bringing in from that primary resource perspective, and that is, of course, archival holdings that are existent at the Newfoundland Labrador Teachers Association, which they were kind to open up and share with me, and also a rich oral historical record. This project draws on the important narratives which were shared with me by figures who were teachers, who were leaders and policymakers, who were involved in advocacy work, primarily, of course, in the post-Confederation period. This work also is in conversation with a rich body of existent literature, drawing on the scholarship of both academics and popular historians. For example, throughout this talk, I'll be drawing on the work of figures like Philip McCann, one of the most prolific authors on education, history in the province, as well as, of course, the work of scholarship of scholars like Gerald Galway and many historians of Newfoundland and Labrador history who focused on religion and on politics, and of course those who focused on teachers, including figures like Harry Cuff, and also, of course, teachers themselves. In many exciting ways, the Newfoundland and Labrador Teachers Association has also been active in recording its own history and sharing that history through its various publications, and I bring that into consideration as well. The talk that I'm hoping to give to you tonight is an argument that I'm working on making and will form a central part of the book project, and that is that in order to understand change, the character, and the reform process and ultimate abolishment of denominational education, that history must center teachers. Teachers played vital roles in the history of education in Newfoundland and Labrador, shaping both, of course, the everyday conduct of the classroom, the experience of students, but also critically through taking on roles that gave them more oversight and ability to influence the system, and also, as we'll explore in this talk, through activism with the Newfoundland Teachers Association, as it was known and founded in 1890, and as it evolved to become more of an active teachers union, particularly in the post-Confederation period. I want to argue here tonight that need to center teachers helps us to understand the complexity of denominational education. The NTA and NLTA, as the acronym I'll use primarily tonight, is of course founded as an interdenominational organization, and it existed and navigated a denominational education system. Crucially, not only did teachers gain gradual influence through their membership with the Teachers Association in the province, but also in their other careers. Throughout the talk, I'll make reference to teachers who went on to have important careers into civil servants, to take on political roles, and of course mention many who went on to play important roles at Memorial University as faculty members. The image that I want to start us off with tonight that forms this title slide is from a conference of teachers in 1898. Crucially, at this time, a quote that has stayed with me from the primary research from one of the denominational superintendents, William Pilot, who was head of the Anglican system at the time, is that this is an era wherein teachers were fragile in many ways in regard to the power they had in the system. The profession often hemorrhaged numbers, and they were poorly paid. In fact, Pilot remarked in one of his reports that teachers were, quote, with people with pay less than that of a policeman or of a post office clerk, and with qualifications incredibly high, incomparably higher. The gradual effort to professionalize teachers, which began in 1876, as we'll explore in this talk, with the creation of formalized grading structures, had an incredible influence on the profession and was part of how they were able to gain power and voice. That's going to be our goal here tonight, is to sort of explore that narrative and that development over time. And while we'll talk a bit about the 19th century, I'll give us a bit of background, for example, on early education, the 19th century and the denominational school system. The bulk of the talk that I'll be giving tonight is going to focus on exploring credentialing, questions of educational policy decision-making, and where and when and how teachers gained influence, and the important debates that shaped the way in which they chose to react to the educational challenges as they evolved throughout the course of history in this province. All right, so I want to begin with a little reflection on the state of schooling in the early 19th century and the origins of Newfoundland, Labrador's state education system. Education systems, as part of the state building process, were common in the 19th century, and it's really the era when they came into being. Schooling, however, was a difficult profession to go into in this period. Teachers were poorly paid. They worked in small classrooms with poor facilities, poor lighting, poor materials for learning. And also, of course, students were infrequent in attendance. But primarily, of course, one of the crux of their issues was that question about remuneration, professional respect, and also how to support themselves. In Newfoundland in the 19th century, prior to the more beginning establishment of a formal education system with the backing of the state, schooling was infrequent, offered in few places, and while tied to certain secular providers, largely the activity and sphere of missionaries and other religious organizations and figures. This, for example, is one of the oldest standing schoolhouses in the province. It is still in existence and maintained with care as a historical site. It's in what was Bristol Hope. It's known as the Mosquito Schoolhouse, and it was built by the Newfoundland School Society, which later became the Continental and Colonial Church Society, as expanded more globally in the British Empire. It was built in 1828 and staffed by teachers associated with the School Society, who were largely missionary figures connected to Anglicanism, but also occasionally Methodism as well. It was in this context of limited access to education, poor quality education, but a growing awareness globally, particularly within the British Empire, that Newfoundland's nascent representative government made its first forays into providing education. The origins of denominational education, which is the defining characteristic of the education in Newfoundland up until 1997, can be traced back to the very first Education Act passed in Newfoundland in 1836. This Education Act was passed largely at the behest of the colonial governor at the time, Henry Prescott, as well as getting significant support from others in the political sphere and also within church folds. However, that first Education Act, its administration was fraught. In laying out a paradigm to establish a state-sponsored system, what this Education Act did was two things. One was that it gave money to already existent providers of education. For example, it gave money to the Newfoundland School Society. It also gave money to religious orders as well as secular providers for their support of their educational efforts. But its main purpose was to set up school boards and invest them with significant powers to build up schools in small outport communities, as well as, of course, in the hubs and bigger centers in and on the Avalon, particularly, of course, in St. John's. Crucially, these boards had significant powers and were also set up for conflict. Part of this was because there was a stipulation in the Education Act that clergy had the right to sit on boards, and that clergy had to be included on boards based on the demographic composition of the district. So, for example, if the district had a significant proportion of both Anglicans, Methodists, and Catholic, you had to have a clergyman from all three denominations. This caused difficult problems because, of course, at this time there were deep divisive opinions about what was the nature of curriculum. There were efforts in particular to advance religious agendas. This was an open point with schooling at this time and a struggle that teachers faced as they were expected to perform both teaching of the 3 R's, but also to play important religious roles in communities. This caused a great deal of consternation and ultimately, as Philip McCann wrote in a very excellent early article, led by 1843 to a no popery crusade wherein the Catholics were pushed off of boards. This was largely at the behest of petitioning efforts by Wesleyan Methodists. However, crucially, this decision in 1843, largely having to do with the use of the Bible in classrooms and debates relating to that, what created the denominational principle, which would be further solidified in 1874. And that was, it did not provide for the right of Catholics to a separate school system in law. Rather, it provided for the right for Catholics as a Christian denomination, comprising at that time about 50% of the population, to have access to a proportional amount of the education grant to set up schools. This, of course, became legal fact. There was continued debate over the expansion of education. There's limited money at this time. Again, drawing on scholarship of Philip McCann, who did some really excellent economic and census-based analysis, we know by the mid-century, teachers are making a paltry sum. For example, salaries are, even for men, barely are at a little over $100. This is not even comparable to other poorer Canadian colonies and later provinces at the time. We're making at least 10s, 20s, and often $50 more, a significant portion of income in the 19th century. The arrival of Anglican Bishop Field in 1844 There was active, constant pressure and agitation to divide the Protestant grant further, as Field, an Anglican and a Tractarian, as has been well discussed by Calvin Hollett, for example, in his scholarship, wanted the type of school system he was familiar with and worked in England. He wanted an Anglican one, and he didn't get along with Methodists, and he didn't get along with Presbyterians, and he didn't get along with Congregationalists. In many ways, Bishop Field was a hard man, and ultimately he was successful and got what he wanted by 1874. This was largely due to the two factors. One was the continued agitation of Anglican clergy who supported Field, and Field himself actively petitioning the legislature. The revelations in 1869 that Anglicans comprised nearly the same proportion as Catholics in terms of making up a portion of the demographics of the colony. And further, the fact that there had been constant problems with the existing system. The school inspectors who had been established in the 1850s for Newfoundland, a Catholic one and a Protestant one, came across numerous problems in creating any type of sort of apparatus to centralize and make the system more effective. This largely was because they had no power over teachers. John Haddon, who was a prolific writer in terms of his school reports, they were lengthy, they're long. He complained about his work constantly, and in all fairness, he seemed to have a terribly difficult job, lamented constantly that he had no ability to instruct teachers and encourage their improvement or manage them in any way because the boards had significant powers and would not cede to a central authority, especially one that might not align with their denominational composition. So in 1874, with the advent of the subdivision of the grant, the paradigm completely shifts. Critical in this is the division of the Protestants and the creation in 1876 of the Office of the Denominational Superintendents. These men would be centralized authorities who would begin to bring order to the school system, or at the very least try to do so. Teachers at the time often gained limited credentials or recognition through an indenture process as pupil teachers, or were simply hired by boards, and their qualifications were very fraught in terms of being able to be evaluated, determined, and or quantified. This effort to professionalize teachers is ongoing elsewhere in the 19th century. For example, this is the era where we see the explosion of what are known as normal schools. The term normal school harkens back to a French school in the 17th century, an école normale, and focus on imbuing normal sort of morals, what have you, to teachers to go out and shape society. And the name crops up in the early version of these in American schools. The efforts to reckon with this teacher problem and the issue of teachers is one of the first priorities of the denominational superintendents. They bring into law at their lobbying, beginning as soon as the system is shaped under the denominational paradigm, to begin teacher certification. What does this look like? Well, one is a more systematic approach to the indenture of pupil teachers. And crucially, it means graded exams. This is the beginning of formal professionalization of teaching in Newfoundland. There is this time still no established normal school, and there are limits in terms of the reach of this policy. For example, it's brought into being in 1876. It becomes compulsory for teachers by about 1879. There's a grant to incentivize them. There's a $2,000 grant that can be used sort of as a top-up to get to their salaries, to incentivize them. And while statistics, unfortunately, are very limited in the period, one example is by 1880, just shortly after the policy, about 55 out of 153 Roman Catholic schools have certified teachers. One of the main reasons to bring in this professionalization regime is to get rid of teachers that are problematic and difficult and are non-subject matter experts, and therefore could never fulfill the aims and ambitions of what is seen as a national project, as something by the denominational superintendents that will enable them to argue churches are good social partners, that they are building up this idea of Newfoundland as a colonial nation state at the time. Crucially, the expectations for obtaining a first grade license at this time are quite challenging and difficult. For example, they demanded advanced skills on the part of teachers in the language arts, expecting them to have strong knowledge of grammar, knowledge of English literature, ability to write in prose as well as in poetry. They expected them to know British and Newfoundland history. Notably, lower grade teachers at this time are not expected to know Newfoundland history. That's still an advanced subject, which is kind of entertaining in a way. They're expected to know world geography. There's not as much expectation until later to know Newfoundland geography. They're expected to be skilled in knowledge about mathematics, to know algebra, to know mental arithmetic, to know Euclidean geometry, trigonometry, navigation, and also to teach surveying and bookkeeping. The demands of these exams were very high and broad in their scope. And what do we know about the process of taking them? Well, we know that for pupil teachers, it was a very slow, sort of a 3-year process that was generally begun around age 16. One of the other things to note as well is that teachers were, even at that time, required to have certificates of character and also health exams, which is a long part as well of policing teachers and discriminatory policies against teachers who had health challenges and disabilities. This course here, drawn from the syllabus in 1876, outlines the sort of essential course of study, talking about and breaking down those expectations that teachers were supposed to learn over that course of indenture. This, of course, meant that teachers needed access to that kind of higher education, much of which was only available in St. John's at the denominational colleges, which, of course, came into being around the mid-19th century, a little earlier in some cases, but were really well developed, somewhat on the English sort of model as a college providing advanced education. The process of professionalization and taking exams was profoundly challenging. While these reports of the denominational superintendents at the time are replete with instances of discussion of teachers who are excellent at their job, and ones also who they find are surprisingly well qualified. For example, there are remarks and stories in these qualitative sources about finding in small rural communities a graduate from Oxford and Cambridge, often a young man estranged from their family, as well as finding skilled teachers of navigational arts and also math who had escaped their service in the Royal Navy and were essentially very difficult to find if there was a ship in the harbor and they were concerned about being caught. But that being said, while certainly high qualified men and women were evident and present in the system, particularly in St. John's, many teachers, particularly in this period of the 19th century, were very poorly qualified. And often one of the other things that we know from this record is that many teachers at this time were older men. They often had families. And in particular, teaching and the use of boards of giving a teacher's salary was also at times used as a social welfare sort of safety net. So, for example, in talking about this process of having to take these broad exams to keep their jobs and also to upgrade their meager salaries, earn that professional respect and recognition in communities, which at times could be very fraught given the fact that teachers were sometimes being deeply sort of suspected as not having credentials this time. What do we know about these exams? Well, we don't know very much because a lot of the records from this period were lost in the 1892 fire. However, some of the reflections, particularly about exams, as opposed to some of the earlier sort of assessments of teachers in the really early 1870s, are found in reflections in a very early magazine of the Newfoundland Quarterly. And this was the aspects piece I wrote for the NQ in the prior year. Writing about what it was like, Superintendent Pilot, that Anglican figure who was ambitious in shaping the school system as it was emerging, wrote about giving an exam to a group of men in Conception Bay. He states, quote, "I secured for the purpose a suitable room and arranged the day before the place where each of the candidates was to sit, and with necessary stationery provided for the fatal day. My every movement had been watched, canvassed, and criticized. What was the meaning of all of this fuss? There was a dozen to be examined, all old men and family men as well. I had been advised to prepare for permission to leave the room and had arranged all that was necessary behind some easels and blackboards in one corner of it. At 9 a.m. sharp, on the day appointed, I was at my post. Nervously suspicious, one by one, the candidates ambled in. I saluted each a good morning and indicated his seat. I was eyed as if I were some cruel ogre. One was late arriving. He told me the chairman of his board had been the cause of it, and so he had been, for after the day was over, that gentleman assured, I had the word of the world to induce him to go to the exam. Sir, he said to the chairman, if it wasn't for the disgrace of the thing, I'd just as soon be going to be hanged. What is he going to do with us? This experience of having their profession and their livelihood threatened was something that we do know in limited ways was deeply challenging for teachers. It could mean going into further poverty, and it was also seen by many teachers as a difficult experience because the outcomes in terms of increase of salary were quite poor. You could still at this time make significantly more money going to work as postal clerk. And this was a really difficult point. However, the effort to professionalize as a means of controlling and shaping the teaching profession to use them through the education system to modernize Newfoundland and Labrador, although education's expansion through the denominational framework in the Labrador is very rudimentary and large and rarely existent in the 19th century. It's more of a project that is a bit complicated even in the early 20th, is something that we can understand as helping us navigate the role that teachers played in shaping denominational education. Now, Pilot had been brought over. He had been a recruit by field to come and teach and to work as a figure in Newfoundland. But he wasn't exactly as related to teaching or teacher activism and unionism. Neither was the Methodist counterpart Milligan, or were some of the earlier Catholic superintendents who there's a bit more turnover on the Catholic side in the 19th century. It's out of this context of the beginning of exams and the creation of more systematic examination of teachers and eventually students as well, that the origins and the founding that we see the origins and the founding of the Newfoundland Teachers Association as it was initially known. The NTA, later NLTA, was founded in 1890. Crucially, it was founded as an interdenominational organization, and it was an association and not an institute. This matters. The founder, James F. Bancroft, was British, and he was familiar with teacher organizing and activism from his home country. He had immigrated and come to Newfoundland, initially working in Methodist and also Anglican schools. He was ardent that teachers needed protection, that they needed to be able to advocate for themselves, that they needed to seek and build out systems that would support them, particularly matters relating to pensions, life insurance, and those types of financial guarantees and securities. The founding of the NTA in 1890 through to 1891 occurred through a series of meetings in Spaniards Bay and Bay Roberts. And also, it was an effort to thwart the aims of the denominational superintendents, particularly Pilot at the time, who was seeking to establish an institute, a further mechanism to support the professional education of teachers, the improvement of their credentials. The early NTA was a very sort of interesting organization. In many ways, it had a lot of vitality to it. It was active in petitioning for teachers and advocating for them, but it also went into a state of collapse by 1893. And notably, Bancroft himself left the profession and became a customs agent, making a much better salary. However, it was revitalized again in this period of the late 1890s, coming on the heels of that more effort to professionalize through examination, the teachers, which also, of course, gained even more steam with the development of an interdenominational exam body known as the Council for Higher Education in 1893. I want to draw your attention here to another important point about understanding the history of the NLTA. This is a picture that sometimes is misconstrued as the founding executive. The founding executive consists of Bancroft and a number of other figures, but this would be the second major executive. And featured in this photo are men who would go on to have profound influence over the denominational school system as it emerged and developed and came through the Confederation period, and also over institutions and policies that shape us to this day. In particular, the man in the back in the middle there is William Black, recall. He again had been another recruit to come over from England. He was, as I mentioned, he was born in 1864, and he was recruited to come over and teach at Bishop Field, at the time, of course, the premier Anglican school and college. He was a teacher. He was in the trenches. He was an advocate for the rights of teachers, but he later also went on to become a denominational superintendent and have immense influence over the course and development of the school system. There in the lower role, the man sitting on a chair with a mustache, and he's a bit more slender, is Arthur Barnes. Barnes, again, was another profoundly influential figure. He would become Newfoundland's first Minister of Education in 1820. He was also a founding figure in the normal school, ardent advocate for teachers, remarkably well educated. He obtained a Doctor of Pedagogy in 1917 from New York University. And the very young-looking man on the far left there, Vincent Burke, VP Burke, would also go on to be an incredibly influential figure. He was also one of Newfoundland's earliest Canadian senators shortly before he passed away in the 1950s, I believe. These men would have important careers through education. Their relationship with the teachers' union would push them into more professional roles, teaching them organizational skills, advocating and elevating their reputation and influence and connections with political elites, and would enable them to go on to have these incredible careers. And this would also, of course, set up for a complicated relationship with the NTA and the denominational system, as there's a lot of going back and forth between those that administrated it and the teachers. And this book speaks to the complexity of the teachers' organization. This is also a picture of the conference. This is not an official NTA conference, but it's kind of understood as one. It was an actual effort to further the education and professionalization of teachers. It was a sort of brainchild of the denominational superintendents. It was well supported, for example, by the government of the day, including members in opposition. And it saw the gathering of about 60% of the teaching workforce in 1898, some nearly 400 teachers, a large proportion of both men and women. This is a photo of them dressed up and taken at the Colonial Building, of course, here in St. John's. Throughout the course of what was about a 3-4 day conference, the teachers were both feted in terms of being entertained by their various denominations, but they also attended public lectures on numerous academic subjects, hearing papers on chemistry, classroom management, and numerous other topics, creating the illusion of a grand fete and an educational moment that was very much a feel-good case. However, that really reflected the sort of obscured some of the underlying tensions that were going on relating to this question of professionalization and the ways in which teachers felt they had very little autonomy in this early period of the late 19th century moving into the 20th. An editorial that was released during the conference caused an incredible stir, so much so that later in the next day in the Telegram, a very well-known Catholic teacher penned another editorial stating very clearly that this was not written by him, as I believe he must have shown people perhaps that he was a bit concerned or annoyed with some of the proceedings. The editorial published in the Telegram slams the conference. It is profoundly critical. It refers to the idea of this conference as a grinding mill. It refers to the state of teachers as pecuniary and poor and terrible. It is seen as an abomination, as a joke. He refers, for example, that this is a really nice moment for government hangers-on and their children and those political parvenus in attendance. He called them platformers and fakers, and he signed the editorial which railed against the convention that he said was filled with useless topics, not focused on teacher well-being and their state, their salaries, of course, at this time, continuing to be barely a few $100s, paling in comparison to other similar professions with lesser education, was appalling to him. And he referred to himself as a second-grade teacher and a slave. And this points to us that incredible tension that's happening as the professionalization of teachers really begins to ramp up moving into the 20th century. Teachers are slowly beginning to take exams, but very few actually have. And the percentage of sort of the graded workforce at the time is, especially those, say, for example, who hold second and first and later what's known as an associate's arts degree grade, they comprise maybe about 50% of the teaching population. And that's by about 1920. It's a really slow process. And gradually, we also know from the writings of those denominational superintendents that there is a sort of very much a case of looking down on grades 2 and 3, and especially on ungraded, seeing those academic credentials and those exams, especially if they were taken 10 years ago, as weak. And there's also was little oversight and challenging if denominational superintendents weren't even supervising those examination boards. My point here is to say that professionalization of teachers was an important effort on the part of those educational administrators, but it was something that was fraught and it was resisted by teachers. It's around this time as well that there's the advent of summer schools. These will become sort of intermittent. The NTA will gain a resurgence in 1908, 1909. The first large-scale formal summer school is established in 1917. It's largely helped out with finances from the Honorable John Harvey. There are, again, many social and denominationally appropriate events. And by that point, figures in the first executive after this, in the second founding, have gone on to play really important roles. Dr. Arthur Barnes, as I'd mentioned, had graduated with his PhD in 1917, and he went on to head the first summer school. Barnes is a fascinating figure. He was in many ways an ardent supporter of Sir Richard Squires, even when the government fell into scandal and problems. His appointment as Minister of Education as well was fraught. But at his core, Barnes cared about teachers. He cared about teacher education and teacher rights. I'm utterly convinced that nobody read his 1917 dissertation, as it was far too radical to give him more jobs within the denominational school system. Barnes was instrumental in the founding of the Normal School. The Normal School was founded in 1920. Crucially, it was not denominational, but it was non-denominational or interdenominational. While there was consideration, particularly about the residence of students who would attend, the focus was primarily on their professional education of teachers. What you see here on the slide is a photo of an early graduating class, likely also associated with Memorial University College about 1925, and a early program of studies that teachers would have taken had they attended that very early normal school in the beginning of about 1921. They would have studied the history of educational theories and practice. We don't know fully the books they were reading, but they might have been starting to read figures like Dewey, for example, study a science of education. One of the reasons we think I think there are progressive elements is because we see references to child study, studying teaching methodology, and also things like vocal music, elocution lessons, drawing, and physical culture. The Normal School is initially a one-year course, and it's around this time that we do see increase in teachers gaining more and more certifications, and therefore also starting to more aggressively assert for and lobby for salary raises, but ultimately they have little and no direct influential power. Heading into the late 20s and the 30s, teachers were seen as a group that could be easily taken. I'm sorry, that's probably not the way to put it, but teachers were sort of seen as a more easier target for cuts and budgetary issues. For example, when the Department when the Depression came on in the 1930s, one of the first main budgets to get completely butchered would be the education grant, particularly the portion that accounted for teachers' salaries. It was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. And in fact, we know from the publications of the Newfoundland Teachers Association that they estimated the average teacher was making maybe $22.50 a month and probably netting or saving about 30 cents, which was a paltry salary. It's around this time that the Normal School is in a bit of flux, but its enrollments are up to about 140 by 31. The effort to restore salaries really brings teachers together. There's a massive petition, and in fact, that petition will actually be read in the British Parliament and ultimately eventually the grant will be restored and teachers will see certain gains in recognition under commission of government. However, that's largely a period of stasis. The normal school will eventually become joined with Memorial University College, and its curriculum will become expanded to 1, 2, and by 1946, a 3-year program. But there's no Bachelor of Education. That comes with Confederation. At this time, the strongholds of denominational education are still quite deep, and schooling is seen by Joey Small with the advent of Confederation as a way to further his modernization agenda. Smallwood as well was an ardent supporter of denominational education. Many speculate that had to do with some of his, anxiety and fear, particularly around religious tensions relating to the Confederation debates, especially, figures like Archbishop Roach, for example. Smallwood, and this is one of my favorite quotes from him, it's from mid-1950s in the legislature, when talking about the school system and who controlled the school system. He stand up and stood in the legislature when he was accused of starting to move the government into ways of taking more responsibility. He stated, in the Hansard we know, "I'm trying to make him understand," he said as a member of the opposition. "It is the churches that build the schools. It is the churches that own the schools. It is the churches that hire the teachers." And that is what's crucial to understand about this period, is while there is a massive expansion of the teaching profession, an active effort to recruit teachers, to expand their professional skills and offerings, there is at this exact same time an effort on the part to firmly relegate the control in their hiring process under the denominational school system. So while they are expected to obtain more credentials, for example, we have the expansion of teacher education at the university. In 1949, we'll have instituted as a founding faculty at Memorial, the Faculty of Education, and the beginning offering of a 4-year Bachelor of Education degree. There'll be more specialized education degrees offered by about 1954, graduating their first classes by about 1965. Salaries in the late 40s, early 50s are again quite terrible. They averaged about $1,000. By 69, they were only up to average about $5,000 and topped out at $10,000. This was a terrible number in comparison to comparable professions such as lawyers and other even civil servants. Even in 1963, teachers were not they were well educated in their professions. They did not hold immense credentials. Only 13% of the workforce held degrees. However, through the Smallwood modernization program and rapid expansion of Memorial, including policies to support going into teaching by giving allowances and eventually sort of student salaries and things as well, that radically transforms the teaching workforce. So one of the things that happens under Smallwood government is the NTA gains statutory membership. It's recognized in 1951. There are also the obtainment of more better salary scales in 54, as well as more recognition and gender parity in terms of salary. This is largely done to also bring back women into the workforce for teachers, because at the time, Newfoundland's population is booming and there's a really dramatic teacher shortage. At the same time, they're trying to expand the creation of high schools. MUN's Faculty of Education in 1955 enrolled only about 306. However, less than a decade later, in the mid-1960s, that enrollment had increased dramatically, adding up to about 1,816 students. And by 1973, only about 1% of teachers had not attended university, and degree credential rates were increasing rapidly. And by about 1984, the mid-80s, about 84% of teachers held university degrees. But the relationships with the Smallwood government were profoundly fraught. There was almost a strike over salaries in 1954 about that very grant. There was tension within the union that teachers should not have the right to strike. And these were really difficult issues. And while the union was going through this question and also trying to understand whether or not it saw itself as a union, teachers were also previously it had connections both to the education system and also to the Teachers Association, were beginning to have increasing and even more influence in government, demonstrating through their contacts, through their obtainment of professional credentials in office, their capability and capacity. For example, the Smallwood government had its largest group is, in terms of professions, the very early group is of teachers. Critically, the first Minister of Education in Confederation, Samuel Hefferton, had been the president of the NTA from 1942 to 1949. He was a teacher and he was an advocate, and he was very difficult in his experience in government, but he strove to navigate that tension between the needs and issues of government and, of course, Smallwood's style of leadership, and also what he knew were real challenging needs being faced by teachers. Other really important educators who would go on to play crucial roles in government include figures like Frederick Rowe, for example, who held the post of Minister in Education, as well as numerous other cabinet posts. But the relationship with the Smallwood government was very complicated. For example, the Warren Commission of the mid-1960s, a really landmark moment in the Smallwood years and in education, brought education roaring back into consideration. The Warren Commission took on the issue of denominational education and advocated for reform, and also was one of the first times there was a big conversation about the state of teachers, about their experiences. It was also one of the first large-scale forums, and when you go through the submissions to the Royal Commission, including individual ones, you find a lot of voices of teachers voicing how they feel education should be reformed. Warren himself was a graduate of Memorial University's first class in education. He had been a principal in Fogo. He had later gone on to do his doctoral degree at the University of Alberta and had come back in the early 1960s to have joined MUN's Faculty of Education. Warren was personally asked by Smallwood to chair the commission and took on these complicated issues, demonstrating again the influence of teachers and leadership at the time. This period also sees the success of the Newfoundland Teachers Organization in terms of building up its physical presence as well. It expanded the types of committees that consisted and comprised the organization and its interests and research and special interest councils. It also constructed its headquarters, which still, of course, is where it's located to today. This is a picture in 1967 of the construction of the building. There on 3 Kenmat Road here in St. John's. But crucial to the issue was the fact that while they were gaining professionalization through obtainments of degrees, being expected to obtain university education, including the expansion of graduate programming, they still had very little real power within the system, partially because they lacked collective bargaining rights. The title for my talk is taken from a conversation I had with one of my informants for the Oral History Project that is still ongoing. The informant was to describe to me his experience of being a young teacher in the late 60s and early 70s, being taken under the wing of a senior teacher and starting to learn the ropes and how things worked. One of the things that was ongoing was, of course, the issue of poor salaries. The two teachers were going to hear the announcement from Smallwood about updates in the budget. And one of the things that stayed with one of my informants was the remarks of that teacher that they were going to find out what they were going to get, what Mr. Smallwood was going to give them. He remarked that what the teachers were involved in was collectively begging. They had no real hard rights. They didn't have a right to strike. They didn't have the same type of legal standing. They were hired and certified by denominational school boards, by church leaders and officials, despite being these new university-educated professionals. And at this time, we know, of course, those numbers are really swelling. This led to the ambition on the part of numerous figures within the NTA. It comprised internal polling, extensive discussion to push for collective bargaining rights. And this came to a head beginning in about the early 1970s, in a period, of course, when the Smallwood years are known for a bit of, the tyrannical side of Smallwood, that issue issue and, of course, the tensions around unionism. And in 1971, under the president of presidency of Walter Call and moving into Gilbert Pike, the NTA actually would reject a salary offer and instigate a multi-month-long rotating strike, trying to make the government listen. The strikes actually and their support had support from the denominational education councils and church leadership, and ultimately they did bear fruit, demonstrating the power of the organization of teachers and the ability to articulate their points, speak with one voice, and be heard in society, and ultimately resulting in 1973, and here we have some of the announcements in the Teachers' Bulletin, their publication, resulting in the rights of collective bargaining. However, while moving into this period of collective bargaining and more influence and power with that formal recognition as a player with rights and voice within the system, teachers were still very fraught. They were expected to be these types of professionals. They were given respect for that. However, the terms of that professionalism and the ways in which it could be withheld from teachers was still firmly in the hands of the church-run elements of the education systems. One of the very interesting moments where this came to the fore was the case of Judy Norman. There are also, of course, numerous cases and moments of flare-ups around these tensions wherein teachers, for example, because of morality clauses, perhaps they'd gotten divorced, maybe they had remarried, maybe a woman had become pregnant out of wedlock, had lost their license, and this had just damaged their professional standing and cost them their job. But in 1972, a really important moment happened in that a big human rights conversation also began to really get started amongst young student teachers at university and also internally within the NTA, and that was the case of Judy Norman. Judy Norman was a young woman completing her education degree while she was registered as a Catholic. That's the family she had come from. She had been baptized. She wished to state affiliated on her certificate. She was refused her certificate despite her excellent grades and standing on the part of the Catholic Education Board, and what ensued was a very much oppressed nightmare wherein Judy Norman was able to advocate for herself, ultimately gaining her certification after intense debate about what constituted professional credentials. This issue being brought more and more to the fore in the 1970s, moving into the 1980s, really saw deep conversations internally as informants have reflected within the NTA, later NLTA, about these tensions over professionalization. And this leads, and I think I've gone a little bit long here, so I'll just try to bring us together and leave lots of time for questions. This beginning of a change in conversation that we've really seen notably happening, particularly following unionization in the 1970s, gaining of more rights as a stakeholder, ability to bargain, led teachers to become increasingly more assertive. Particularly, we see evidence of this in their actions, both in terms of striking during the Peckford years. There are a series of strikes, including one in Labrador West in the 1980s over issues relating to salary and workers' rights, but also in their desire to enter into policy conversations. The Newfoundland Teachers Association internally had complicated conversations. It reflected on members' perspectives through surveys, through informal conversations and discussions, and especially through branch meetings about how to navigate denominational issues, but ultimately focusing on professionalization, conversations, particularly at the executive level, came to realize that teachers were in a difficult position, largely because they were not in full control via their collective bargaining agreement over their own credentials, because certification was contingent upon the decision of those church-controlled larger educational boards, that they could gain their university credential, not meet a religious requirement, and not get a license and be denied the ability to teach. This was particularly a keen moment in a young teacher's life, who of course went on to various important political roles and an influential career in Newfoundland in lots of ways, and that was Roger Grimes. Roger Grimes was a young teacher. He started teaching in 1972. Grimes was from central Newfoundland, the Grand Falls, Windsor area, area, and he had been born Pentecostal. But his relationship with the faith was complicated in terms of his own perspective on the denominational school system. And he very nearly didn't become a teacher because, in having to take his mandatory religion course, as he related to me in an interview, he did not want to write the required essay stating the arguments for why the denominational school system was a good thing. After intense conversations with his instructor, who took a big risk on young Grimes, he allowed him to write an essay arguing the opposite. And while he didn't get a good grade, he did pass the course and was able to go on teaching. And while initially he did teach in the Pentecostal system and then the Catholic one, Grimes's career was complicated, involving getting into union grievances over the teachers and seniority. And he was acutely aware of these religious issues. Grimes would go on to become the president of the NTA in the mid-1980s and would be a key figure, along with the executive, in advocating for teacher rights related to seniority and professional credentials as in their contracts. This led the NTA, in the climate of an economic downturn and debates about continuing denominationalism prior to some of the more raucous debates of the late 80s and early 90s, to propose a fundamental shift in policy. They did this by submitting the brief Exploring New Pathways to the provincial government, Peckford government at the time. And this brief was really quite remarkable. It proposed legislative changes. It asserted new directions for teacher training and education, and was actually really interestingly critical in different ways of Memorial's faculty of education. But crucial was its third premise, which was pathways from isolation. While it didn't call for abolishment of the denominational system, it did advocate for full integration. Ultimately, Grimes would go into government under Clyde Wells in 1990. He later, in the 1990s, he later would be Minister of Education under Brian Tobin when denominational education was abolished. What we can see through looking at the long history of teachers, understanding their development from the 19th century, is that this professionalization narrative was one that was really fraught for teachers. It was an expectation. It was challenging. It was something pushed upon teachers and often used as a way to control them. But ultimately, it also started to become a powerful and important discourse that they used to advocate for themselves. By the time we're in the 1990s, and debates about denominational education, for a number of reasons, which you can speak about, question, are really ramping up. Ultimately, teachers will play profoundly influential roles in advocacy for change in the 1990s. The chair, for example, of the Royal Commission will be Len Williams, who is a president of the NTA. There will be teachers in government as Minister of Education as Phil Warren, initially under Clyde Wells. And despite engaging with government to enact reform, there's even a strike against Clyde Wells' policies in 1994. What I hope to wrap up with here as a sentiment is that teachers advocated for themselves, they sought professionalization, and ultimately positioned themselves through that process as a group that had to be heard, that had voice in the education system, and were indeed able to have that influence in multiple ways. So thank you so much for listening to my talk about teachers tonight, and I'm just so glad to have gotten to spend some time talking to you about this important history.
Good.